we're getting into James chapter 1 in order to be informed enough to go into James chapter 2. The question is, when a believer who is undergoing testing is tempted to do evil, he should not say, God is tempting me. He has stopped short of perseverance and failed the test. Otherwise, Greek words rendered tempted and tempting me respectfully are from the same root for trial in verses 2 and 12, which can mean trial or temptation. The context of this passage is of tempting one to do evil, concerning the phrase, for God cannot be tempted by evil. Hence we have in view a believer who is tempted to do evil, implied by the second half of the verse, wherein no one should say, God is tempting me with evil to do evil. The fact that a believer is being tempted to do evil, one can infer from this that it is caused within the believer himself, not God. The context of the believer persevering under trials continues to be in view, in which there is inherent in the trial the possibility that the believer would still permit himself to be tempted to do evil and blame it on God, in which case one has not persevered under trial, and one has failed the test, and guess what? You're going to go through it again. If a Christian does not love God, St. Hodges says, a wrong attitude toward testing can easily arise. The crown of life, therefore, is for those who love him, but not for those who accuse God of tempting them with evil. It may be safely said that in every trial, in the broad sense, which we have, there is also a temptation to do evil in a narrow sense. But it's up to within you, not up to God. Sources of temptation to do evil include the world, the devil, and his demons. All individuals, unbelievers and believers, but never God. So let no one say when he is tempted, I am tempted by God. The word tempted in this context is defined by tempted by evil, since this verse stipulates that God cannot be tempted by evil, nor does he tempt anyone. Then we may conclude that the temptation to do evil must originate and be responded to outside of God, which leaves the world, the devil, and his demons, all individuals, unbelievers alike. So, since subjective temptation by the believer to do evil must come outside of God, then one must conclude that the believer has a capacity to be tempted to do evil as part of his nature. Another proof of the sin nature within man. When you become born-again believer, it doesn't mean you lost the sin nature. Since one cannot say God is tempting me to do evil, then the temptation must come outside of God, the world, and or oneself. Evidently, there remains within the believer's nature a capacity to do evil as a response of being subjected to temptation, as the next verse teaches. In fact, as St. Hodges says, one of the temptations we may face in times of trial is the temptation to blame God for the inward inclination toward evil, which usually surfaces under stress. I can identify with that. If we love God properly, we will never say that the evil inclinations are his responsibility. The person who claims I am tempted by God has forgotten that God cannot be tempted by evil, nor does he tempt anyone. Instead, the source of our temptations is the inward pull exerted by our own evil desires. If we were not evil people, we would have no such desires and would be free of wrong impulses. That's not the case. Although God is not the source of any kind of temptation to get someone to do evil, he permits it in order that believers can persevere under such testing toward maturity. Despite the fact that God is not the source of any kind of temptation to get someone to do evil, nevertheless temptation is stipulated as occurring in the world. Hence we can conclude that God, being sovereign, permits such temptation within the context of this passage of persevering under testing in order to be mature, complete, and not lacking in anything. There's no testing if there isn't some situation in the world, the devil, yourself within you, or his angels, angelic beings, to cause problems and divert you from focusing on God. The better you focus on God, the better results will come from your test, and the better your eternity will be enhanced. It is worth noting that James affirms of God that he himself does not tempt anyone. This means that God is not personally the agent of temptation, but James's words leave room for the truth that God allows the others to engage in temptation. So let's add a couple more verses here. Let no one say when he is tempted, I am being tempted by God, for God cannot be tempted by evil, and he himself does not tempt anyone. And verse 14, but each one is tempted when he is carried away and enticed by his own lust. There, that answers the question of 13. It's within you, or the devil or the world. The subjective, i.e. personal source of temptation to do evil is the evil desire, the sin nature within that individual, not God. All individuals have, even believers have sin natures. So each believer, when he is tempted to do evil, positively responds to that temptation when his own evil desire drags him away and entices him. If you lose sight of the fact of why you're there in that situation, you have an opportunity to enhance your eternity. Instead, you throw it away. So the subjective personal source of temptation to do evil by the believer is the source of evil desire within the individual himself, not God, or sin nature. Your own sin nature. Notice that since believers are in view, we can conclude that believers have sin natures. Clearly then, to repeat, then in this passage, James is thinking of temptation in the subjective personal sense. All Satan's efforts to lead people into evil and all of the world's seductions would have no effect on a person at all unless he is drawn away by his own desires and enticed. So in the world, the devil, they don't force you to do evil, but they certainly tempt you, and then it's your decision. In the final analysis, James is right. There is no temptation for us except when we respond to some seduction in an inward way and find the evil in some way desirable. Thus, the readers of James's letter must not sinfully charge God with responsibility for their temptations. Rather, the responsibility is their own because of their own wicked hearts. So the believer is tempted to do evil by being dragged away from that which is righteous by his own desires. Hence he is enticed to do evil. He has made a decision to sin. The blame is in the believer. The cause of a believer being tempted to do evil is his own sinful desire, which drags his mind away from that which is righteous, enticing him to commit sin. So the positive response to external temptation resulting in sin comes from within the believer himself. Reminds me of Paul in Romans chapter 7, fighting within himself. The source of temptation lies within man himself. He is tempted by his own evil desire. James personifies man's sinful desire and identifies it as the efficient cause of temptation. He does not blame any external person or object. It is by man's own sinful nature that he is dragged away and enticed. These two verbs are taken from the sphere of fishing and hunting, although dragged away is a possible translation of the Greek word when it is coupled with the Greek word which means enticed. It may better be rendered by drawn out. James pictures man's evil desire first as attracting his attention, and persuading him by means of bait to yield to the temptation. 13 to 15. Then after desire is conceived, it gives birth to sin, and sin, when it is full grown, it gives birth to premature physical death. That's a pretty scary thing. Get a little water here. So, in view of verse 15, one is subjectively, in other words, personally, tempted to do evil when drawn away from righteousness by one's own evil desires, and enticed to respond. Sin is then conceived in the mind, whereupon one acts upon that mindset, giving birth to that sin. Interesting. If you're personally tempted, you get drawn away from righteousness. You're not stubborn to stick to God's righteousness, so you open it up. Okay, let's entertain this temptation, and then one's evil desires get enticed to respond, and then sin is then conceived in the mind, wherein one then acts upon that mindset, giving birth to that sin. One is subjectively, personally tempted to do evil when one is drawn away from righteousness by one's own evil desires to do that evil, and then enticed to respond to do that evil. Sin is then sin conceived in the mind, whereupon one acts upon that mindset, giving birth to the reality of sin. James now goes on, St. Hodges goes on to say, James now goes on to trace the potentially deadly consequences into which man's evil desires can lead him. The language he employs is the language of childbearing. Desire, if it were a woman, experiences a conception when desire is conceived, in other words, and subsequently gives birth to sin. When sin is responded to the extent it becomes a pattern in the believer's life, full-grown sin, resulting in premature physical death. So when it is full grown, it gives birth to premature. Let's see what that means. Actually, it's going to physically die early. Excuse me. Should have worn my other jacket. Okay. So when sin is continually repeated, it can and does become full grown into a lifestyle pattern. It brings forth then premature physical death. The believer who permits sin to become full grown in his life will not live out his appointed years, because physical death is the ultimate result of a sinful pattern in his life. He will go home early to be with the Lord. This is evidently not a good thing to do when sin is the cause. Notice that brothers are in view, true believers. If we analyze the experience of temptation, James's words are instructive. Desire, he says, is the old mother of sin. Perhaps we might even suggest that such conception occurs when desire or lust is united with the human will, so that the birth of sin becomes a determination of the heart. But after the sin is brought to birth through lust, it grows or is repeated and reaches maturity, when it says, i.e., full grown. Then sin in turn bears a child of its own, namely death. Sin brings forth physical death. Death then is the grandchild of sinful lust or desire. Death is the cul-de-sac into which our lusts can lead us. Since James is writing to his Christian brothers, it is plain that even a born-again Christian can first with the premature physical death by indulging his sinful lust. He can flirt with premature physical death by indulging his sinful lust. Keep in mind, if you keep that ever in mind, maybe you distance yourself from that. This is an extremely serious condition. So, expositor's comments. James changes his figure from a snare to conception and birth. The genealogy of evil desire is traced for 3 generations, as it were, chronological order suggested by the words then and after. First, temptation comes. Then desire, like a human mother, conceives and gives birth to sin. In this graphic manner, the author portrays the experience of yielding to temptation. Then sin, the child of evil desire, develops till it is full grown and ready to produce offspring. When it conceives, it gives birth to premature physical death, dying early. I have enough trouble. Eternal death due to sin is not in view. But each one is tempted when it is by his own evil desires dragged away and enticed. Each believer, then after desire is conceived, it gives birth to sin, and when it is full grown, gives birth to premature physical death. There's no indication here that the full grown sin in one causes eternal death, especially believers who are in view in this passage. Words such as eternal death, lake of fire, condemnation are not present, but brothers are in view. Believers already saved unto eternal life who will not face eternal death are being addressed in this chapter. Furthermore, the picture of giving birth to sin, and then sin becoming full grown in a believer, leading to physical death, does not have eternal death in view, but physical death. One does not receive eternal death at the point when sin becomes full grown in one is already under condemnation unto eternal death before the first sin is given birth to, much more permitting it to become full grown. All men are born in sin without committing sin, and are destined to eternal death without having to give birth to a single sin until they become believers, much less permitting sin to become full grown in oneself. So avoiding eternal death is not in view. Avoiding full grown sin unto eternal death for a believer is. So we add another verse there. Every good and perfect gift is from above, coming down from the Father of the heavenly lights, who does not change like shifting shadows. There's a lot of good information here. So it says, let no one sin when he is tempted, I am tempted by God. For God cannot be tempted by evil, nor does he himself tempt anyone. But each one is tempted when, by his own evil desire, he is dragged away and enticed. Then after sin is conceived, it gives birth to sin. And sin, when it is full grown, gives birth to premature physical death. And he says, don't be deceived, my dear brothers. Every good and perfect gift is from above, coming down from the Father of the heavenly lights, who does not change like shifting shadows. More on this next time.